Welcome, everybody. And today I'm really happy to have Ari Wallach as my guest. He's the author of Longpath, which is really what we will be talking about today. But more than that, it's really the vision of the future and how we can help be others and ourselves being better ancestors or great ancestors to the future generations to come. So welcome, Ari. And I will just start right in there.
Great. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here with you.
How did you start about when did everything come together and Longpath as such was born?
Yeah. When we think about Longpath or the book and what Longpath is, which I'm sure we'll get into in a second, you think, this kind of starts maybe, most authors or thinkers who do work like this, they think, it goes back a couple of years. They've been working on this. Truth be told, in many ways, Longpath really starts probably in the 1920s, which I know sounds odd because I'm not that old. But my father was born in 1922 in a small town in Poland. Now that town is in Belarus. And so when he was, an older teenager, Germany invaded and all the Jews in the town were forced into a small ghetto. And without going into the full story, he ended up escaping the ghetto, joining the Jewish underground, the resistance, and then was also like a Nazi hunter after the war, made his way to Cuba, to Mexico, where he met my mom, who was an American, but was in Mexico studying Mayan architecture and city planning because she had been a student of Buckminster Fuller, the famous architect and futurist. Mm-hmm. So the reason I kind of start the story about Longpath there is because it was really in many ways growing up in a home where I had one, where my father was very much kind of focused on many ways, the things that could go wrong, right? He'd seen kind of the worst of humanity, but he'd also seen the best of humanity, even sometimes in the same day, in the 1940s in these small towns fighting the Germans. On the one hand, he'd see atrocity. On the other hand, it would be the kindness of of a farmer who would leave food out, knowing that if they were caught for leaving food out for the partisans, they themselves could be killed. So he kind of existed in that world. On the flip side, my mom very much kind of existed in a world of not what could go wrong, but really what could go right. That's very much what Buckminster Fuller was always kind of talking about, which is like, what are the futures that we want? So I'm raised in this home where any kind of conversation around the dinner table, and we had dinner as a family probably 6 nights a week, 7 nights a week, sometimes together. Any conversation about politics or what was going on always had a very historical kind of lens on it, as well as a futures lens on it. And so for me, anything that was being kind of discussed or talked about always existed on a very kind of broad timeline. It wasn't just looking forward. It wasn't just looking backward. It was obviously in the present where we were, but it would kind of be omnidirectional in that way. And that's very much the spirit of Longpath. People often think, oh, this is a book written by a futurist. It's all about tomorrow. But my dad used to say, tomorrow started yesterday. And so when we think about where we are and how do we want to become great ancestors and why tomorrow needs us to be great ancestors, it very much necessitates that we don't just start from today and look forward, but we recognize that we're on a much kind of broader, interlinked timeline as a species on this planet. And that's kind of where the Longpath really kind of took its seeds. But fast forwarding, it wasn't probably until 2016. I had been running a company called Synthesis Corp, and we helped very large organizations like the UN and the US State Department think about the long term and how do you deal with the issues that are coming. And two things became very obvious to me, especially around the 2016 election here in the United States, was one, the way we were going about this was too short-termistic. We were thinking 3 to 5 years out, right? And it was too also short-termistic in an odd way, looking backwards. We only looked at the past 3 to 5 years, as opposed to a much larger timelines that were necessary. And two, I was trying to figure out what is and was going on in kind of global civilization that was causing both a rise of short-termism and a kind of disconnection from the deep past and the deep future, and also why short-termism felt amplified, why people were making decisions seemingly not about the next 10 to 100 years, but they could barely wrap their head around the next 10 days or 10 hours. And so that's what led to this, and I'm sure we'll talk about this idea of the intertidal and this kind of the moment that we're in. So all of that was the kind of the genesis behind Longpath, and then switching over from doing what I was doing with my company Synthesis Corp to creating Longpath Labs, where we really focus on these major kind of wicked issue opportunities that are facing our species over the next, several decades to several centuries, and B, how do we actually tackle those, not from a policy top-down perspective, which is an area that I was probably most comfortable in because I've been working in that for a long time, but also from a kind of mindset perspective. Because it's one thing to say, oh, here's a white paper and a list of policies that will change and make the world better. But as we all know, because we all operate in reality, just having something written in a white paper or on a whiteboard doesn't mean it's actually going to happen. There are obviously deeper things at play. And so the book and the work and this idea of Longpath as a mindset was born from those observations.
Yes, it's true that we mostly forget about what happened yesterday or the week before or even a year, and we are just looking forward, but not that much. But we are actually really the sum of our experience, our upbringing, but also from our parents, grandparents, and so on. So we have kind of like a baggage. We have to we don't have to, but we take with us, often unconsciously.
Yeah, I mean, I'm only laughing because I was thinking about a conversation I had earlier today with my wife, where it was all about that stuff from the past, right? You get into argument. I have 3 young children, so 2 of them are teenagers, and you'll get into a conversation with them that may get a little heated, and you realize how much of how you are behaving in that conversation is based on triggers that go back to your parents, that go back to your grandparents, that go back multiple generations, that, for what it's worth, go back hundreds of thousands of years. Not because of what someone did hundreds of thousands of years ago specifically, because I don't think 150,000 years ago there were arguments about whose turn it was to empty the dishwasher. What it was about other issues about how we relate to one another and what are the kind of driving forces that push our species forward. At the same time, also, I think this is kind of embedded in your observation, what we pass on is how we behave and model behavior, right? So I will pass on, and already have, to my children, certain genetic adaptations, adaptive fitnesses, right? This is all about mate selection and moving the species forward. Great. But also how I talk to my children or my partner. And by the way, you don't have to have children to practice Longpath. It's anyone kind of around you. But really, the younger folks are the ones that are going to kind of go probably more forward than us, right? And so, that's embedded in Longpath is how you behave and model behavior and react in situations is future making, right? That's a big part of the book, is how you are as a human to another human is more future shaping than whether or not you have a big idea like the Marshall Plan or getting to Mars. These are very future-y things, and people love to focus on those. We tend not to think about the micro actions as future making. But again, that's a big part of Longpath, is how you are in the world moment by moment. It is, especially when you think about that at massive scale, is what actually creates futures for our species.
Yes, I think that we're in a world where it's really all about do, to have, to be. And I prefer switching this around and be, and then you do, and then you have. And it doesn't have to be material. And what I really liked in the book is you're bringing back the emotions, which have kind of a negative view. People view it as something negative or not so good. But we are human beings, and we have to be, and emotions are part of us. So I really love the way that you put together and bring back the emotions, the mindset, how we behave, actually. Because this is something we forget too much in our society nowadays.
Yeah, look, emotions are incredibly important. And the reason we discount emotions is because for a very long time, we didn't understand where they came from, what their role was. And so part and parcel of somewhat the Renaissance, but really the Enlightenment, and as we move into a kind of an overly scientific, hyper-rational way of looking at the world, which, by the way, is great. It gives us the internet. It gives us penicillin. It gives us all these major, amazing advances. But what it also does is it says, if you can't measure it, if you can't see it or quantify it, it's no good. Let's get rid of it. And that worked in one way, right? And part of what that did, obviously, was to help eradicate the theological power of the church, especially in Europe, especially kind of as we're moving from, from the fall of the Roman Empire till the kind of rise of the Renaissance, about 1,000+ years of rule by religion, where so much of it is not quantifiable, right? And so, but it wasn't, the way we think of kind of spirituality today, where it's kind of rising to higher planes of it. No, this was a command and control, very bureaucratic, very kind of dark time for at least for the global north, for Europe. And so what the Enlightenment gives us is a way of kind of pushing back against that and saying, no, the universe doesn't revolve around the earth. We have this thing called the telescope. We revolve around the sun. And so we're able to kind of push back against the theological power of the church as a kind of political apparatus. But what happens in that is, the things that we can't measure, especially the things that are scary and understandable, get pushed to the side. The big one here, obviously, being emotions, right? And for what it's worth, because for various reasons, we tend to think as women, quote unquote, as being more emotional, whereas I'd argue are just probably just more, we're all emotional. There's just a narrative of the stoic man to push that away, which has its own ramifications that we're still dealing with centuries later. So what happens is, when it comes to thinking about the futures that we want, we fall into this kind of official future narrative, especially right now at this part of the 21st century, that has been hyper de-emotionalized, right? We're not allowed to have kind of this understanding of when we think about what the future is going to be, this quote unquote official future, especially on the tail end of this kind of Enlightenment binary way of thinking, disconnecting humans from nature and whatnot, is it becomes very much around kind of monorails and jetpacks and quantum computing. And we never stopped and think, well, okay, if we think about Homo sapiens 50 years from now, 150, 500 years from now, we never stop and say, how do we want them to feel? What is that lived, embodied emotions around them? We kind of think, well, what does the external world look like, but not what does the internal world look like? And so a lot of what Longpath does in the book, and what I'm kind of laying out as a way of thinking and feeling into the future, is that there's a good chance we're still going to be very similar. We're still going to have emotions. And instead of trying to bury them, recognize that emotions aren't so much about the past. That was kind of where Freud led us to believe. They're really about the future. They're really about helping us guide they're helping us guide our behavior in the moment to create better futures. So when we eradicate emotions from a kind of way that we operate in the world, it's like literally going through the world with one arm and one leg tied behind your back, right? It's just one part of who we are. That arm and leg still want to be there and still working, and they trip us up when we don't work with them. So what I ask for in the book, and what we give exercises for, is to help people think about how can they skillfully use and work with emotions. It's not like in Star Trek, the character Spock, who didn't have any emotions, but he actually did, because remember, he was half Vulcan and half human, right? And that became a special power. What I'm asking for is for people to realize emotions are there. We have to work with them. They can't take us over. And at the same time, they can help guide us to creating better futures, because when we start thinking about how do we want our great, great, great grandchildren to feel, what are the kind of emotional what's the emotional matrix and schema that they are operating in, it then starts helping it. This is the trick of the book. It helps us make better decisions in the moment. Because it's, yes, we need to work on climate change and poverty and think about AI and bioengineering, all these big issues. But when it becomes overly intellectualized, we find ourselves kind of backed into a corner about how do we make decisions. If we start making decisions at a more human level, which is what you're alluding to, then we can start making more kind of ethical and moral decisions based on literally how we want our descendants to feel, which at the end of the day is how we go about our day, right? Is kind of as feeling beings, not about what kind of computers that we're on. So that's why that's where emotions come from, what happened to them, and why they're so important to helping us create these better futures.
It's funny because nowadays, when you look at marketing, for example, the ads and so on, they play on our emotions. But on the other side, they ask us to be disconnected totally. And I think that when you start connecting back to your emotions, you're also able to connect to the next generations and to humanity as a general.
Yeah, I mean, there's a full spectrum of emotions, and some of the emotions that I think we're used to the kind of, we know anger, we know sadness very well because we talk about them a lot, but the pro-social emotions like empathy and awe and self-compassion and compassion in general are not ones that we have been cultivating in the way that we should, because when we do, and we can talk about why we don't, but the short version is we don't do it because if we did do it, it would lead to a less competitive society, which has, it's in the interest of a lot of folks to keep us very, very competitive. Let's put it that way. Yeah. So, but when we start to kind of cultivate these, what we call pro-social emotions, like awe and empathy specifically, what it actually does is it opens us up to moving away from a place of like tight anxiety, which happens in this intertidal moment, and into a place where we can start thinking more with greater imagining creativity and more and a generativity around what is it that we have to do to ensure flourishing for ourselves in the current moment. So there's a little bias here. I'm not saying we have to give up anything necessarily to think about future generations. And actually, by cultivating these pro-social emotions, it makes us feel better, less anxious, more expansive today. And therefore, the behaviors and decisions we make also become more expansive for a more flourishing tomorrow for future generations. So it's kind of like a win-win situation if we're willing and open to going there.
Yeah, I think that it's more that there is no black or white. I think there is in between, and people have forgotten this in between.
The in between space is that it is very uncomfortable in a kind of, like I said, hyper rational enlightenment world, right? It's either, if you think about how computing works, right? Even computing language is zeros and ones. It's binary, black or white, right? It's a very kind of broken down way of looking at the world. Now, again, if I'm doing certain scientific experiments, I do want to know yes or no, right? I'm uncomfortable with the maybe, because you want to keep breaking things down until you understand the actual individual parts. The problem is in doing that, we lose that in-between area understanding, which is actually where a lot of stuff happens in nature. It's not all zeros and ones. But it's like if you see it, you be it, right? And because we live in this hyper-rational world of either yes, no, without a maybe, without a kind of nuance, because nuance is messy. It's emotions. It's not perfectly logical. What we end up doing is we think that's how the world works, but it's just not, right? We had to go through a period of going from the kind of, like, again, this theological power that the church had and everything. And I'm far from anti-religious, but that older way of doing it over the Middle Ages, we had to break that down and get hyper-rational, because that would take the power away from certain religious authorities that were dictating our lives. The problem is we haven't built back up again. We haven't figured out how do we actually co-arise both as scientific rational thinkers, but in a way where we're also using our emotions to help guide us in what we have to do. And that necessitates an understanding of that in-between space and that nuance and being comfortable with it. And it's something that we inherently, I shouldn't say inherently, it's something that we become less comfortable with over the past several centuries, because we were told that was bad and it wasn't measurable and it wasn't quantifiable. But now we realize it's, if we want better tomorrows, we have to get better at being comfortable in that in-between space.
Yeah, I think it's really about how you want to feel and not what do you want to have. It's how you want to feel at the end of the day.
Look, no one. I talk a lot about death in the book, which is surprising for a book about the future. But no one, when I've talked to people who do hospice or with people who have, who are getting close to passing, no one ever says, "I wish I had more stuff. I had more material things." Right? It's always about regrets. On the negative side, regrets about things and relationships they didn't repair or they didn't have, and hopefully it's also looking back on the emotional connections they had with other people, the non-material. Those are the things that really matter. But in a kind of hyper-capitalistic world we are told those things don't matter. But we are seeing a generational shift. I will tell you, and I think kind of COVID accelerated this.
Yes, for
People
sure.
are rethinking what actually matters in their lives. And what they realize is it's less about the material things, right? Because we were surrounded by material while we were all locked down for a year or two, depending on where you live, or maybe even still locked down. So we had all the material, but we were missing something. We were missing the human, emotional, face-to-face connection. And you don't know how much you need and miss something until it's gone, right? And so now people are looking back and saying, okay, I had all this stuff. I was able to order all the stuff that I needed, and I still wasn't happy. What really matters? And it's those experiences with other humans and or in nature, those connections, those taking yourself out of yourself, that really is most people are starting to look. And I realize it's from a privileged place. If you're living paycheck to paycheck or hour by hour, you don't know where your next meal comes from, the material still matters, right? But for folks who are fortunate enough to be out of that state of being, they realize that living in a post-material life is incredibly important.
Mm-hmm.
The issue is we do not have a global economy set up to deal with that, right? So I think what we're seeing in terms of global inflation and the rise of populist politics, we are in many ways are kind of at the beginning of this great transition towards a different way of being. And again, I talk about this in the book around kind of this idea of intertidal that we're
That's
in.
what I want. Yeah.
The old ways are dying and the new ones are yet to be born, and that's where we are right now. And so you're getting at it. You're picking up on a big thread of where we are right now in this post-materialistic way of looking and being and emoting and being embodied in the world. We just don't know how to set up kind of our operations around that in terms of an economy, in terms of how we live, how we educate, how we eat. All those things are very much up for grabs right now.
Yes, so intertidal, as you explained in the book, it's really and I think that COVID, all this lockdown situation, may have accelerated it, or we are more aware of where we are right now.
Yeah.
That there is a shift, but people don't know exactly what to do next. So how can we do the best out of this intertidal?
Yeah, I mean, so this is, I again alluded to this at the beginning of the conversation. Like, this is why I took some time to really write Longpath and really kind of like think about this moment. So just to step back for a second, an intertidal, if we were at, is a very specific. It's called the intertidal zone. So anyone who's ever been to kind of the edge of an ocean knows what this looks like. It's that piece of land that sometimes is below water and sometimes is above water, based on the tides. It can be more dramatic in some places. It can be a 20-foot difference. In other places, it's only 4 feet. But if you've ever been in an intertidal zone that stretches far out, you'll know there's all sorts of different creatures there, like different crabs and animals that kind of exist. It's an area of chaos, though, because, again, sometimes above water, sometimes below water. There's very few places like that on the planet that have such dramatic shifts. So as a global, as a planetary species, Homo sapiens right now, it's my contention, are going through its own intertidal. Now, what that means is the old ways of doing things, the old narratives, the stories, the way we think about the world, and we've talked about this in terms of enlightenment, hyper-rationalization, capitalism, the material, all that we now see isn't working. At the same time, we don't know what the next thing is, right? And we've gone through this before. I would say probably the first major intertidal for Homo sapiens was the shift from hunter-gatherer to an agricultural society about 10, 12,000 years ago. We literally went from nomadic to sitting in place, domesticating animals and crops, building larger and larger, moving from groups of 20 to 30 that may encounter another clan of 20 or 30 maybe every few years, if ever at all, to now all of a sudden deciding to kind of a conglomerate in one specific urban area. How dramatic was that last intertidal? That's kind of where we created God, right? If we think about God as a monotheistic God, why? Because we went from being a clan-based group where you and I could see what we were each doing, if we were slacking off or not, right? We went to a thing where we now had walls and we could be in private and there could be deception. So we needed kind of a new narrative, a new thing that could see behind and through walls, that was omnipotent, that could always see your actions to keep you ethical. Again, this is kind of the evolutionary biologist in me, ensuring that we stayed true to the workings of the group to help it flourish. So then now we have this thing called God. So that's how dramatic that big intertitle was. The last probably major one I alluded to was the kind of the fall of the Roman Empire. And again, I know I have a Western bias here, but that's very much what I've studied and what I know. And these have existed in Africa and Asia, but in the global north, we have the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, that one didn't go so well. That led us into 1,000 years of Middle Ages, and then the way we came out of that intertitle was, like I said, the rise of the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution. And again, intertitles aren't necessarily good or bad. They're an amazing place where it can go one way or the other. And so one of the things that happens in an intertitle, though, more so than not, is because of the lack of an official narrative, an official future, an official kind of what is going to happen next, we become very laser focused on the short term. Because if you think about, again, Homo sapiens, if you think about us, Catherine and Ari walking through the Serengeti 15,000 years ago, and a tiger jumps out, right? We are going to react very quickly. We're going to be very short-termistic. We're very laser focused on survival because we are not in a safe place, right? But when we go into a valley with lots of fruits and vegetables, and we have weapons and we can protect, we can start thinking longer term. That's what happens, by the way, from in that major intertitle, from hunter-gatherer to agriculture. We can start thinking seasonally. Instead of thinking going from tree to tree to tree to fruit, we're actually thinking, okay, we're going to be here for a while, and there's going to be a cold winter. How do we store food? So that's where the long term starts coming about. But again, what happens
was basically one year at most.
Yeah, it was 1 year at the most, or one through the winter season, right? And so, So now we're in this intertitle. We don't know what's going to happen next, and in layman's terms, everyone is freaking out. So part of what that freaking out is because it's cognitively taxing to exist without an official future narrative of, tomorrow's going to look like this. Because when we know what tomorrow's going to look like, it allows us to kind of relax a little bit, because we don't have to be hyper anxious, based kind of living on adrenaline or cortisol, right? It's all about the brain. Mm-hmm. We can it can be more serotonin, it can be dopamine. We can kind of relax and be in the moment, if you will. In an intertitle, we are firing on pure cortisol and adrenaline. Now, what doesn't help and actually amplifies this is technology, and specifically social media, where our phones are going off every 3 seconds based on what leader has done what, and it puts us very much on edge. And so all of those things come together to create kind of an algebra of hyper short-termism, hyper presentism, and I don't mean Buddhist presentism. I mean presentism where there's no tomorrow, there's no yesterday. We're just in this very moment, just trying to exist on this high wire. And so therefore, and this is the work that I was doing kind of 2016, kind of realizing and putting bits and pieces of research together from anthropology, evolutionary biology, political science, psychology. And that's what got me to kind of develop Longpath. So again, Longpath is a verb. It is an applied mindset that if one brings into their life, there are many different ways of doing this. I'm not saying this is the only way, but Longpath is kind of my contribution to folks who want to think about how do you navigate this intertitle as an individual and as a society? How do you find yourself in this moment and not going hyper short-termism, not becoming hyper anxious or hyper depressed, but actually kind of seeing where we are with clarity, skillfully navigating through this moment to kind of get to the other side. Now, I never say in the book what that other side looks like. Very specifically, I don't do that. And some people who have read the book say, this is an amazing book, but you don't tell us what it looks like on the other side.
But it's normal. I mean, we don't have one future. There are so many possibilities, no?
So those are the three. So there's 3 pillars of what the Longpath mindset are, right? The first one is futures thinking with an S. Now, for some people, they're like, no, I don't want to be futures thinking. I just want the singular future, right? I just want to know the one thing we're heading towards. I understand the desire for that. But what that ends up doing is it locks us in to a very specific way of thinking about tomorrow, that if there's any deviation from that, we're going to fall apart. Here's an open secret. There's always a deviation, right? We're never fully going to hit that official future in many ways. So what futures thinking is about stepping back and recognizing there are multiple futures. And what that does is it puts agency back in the hands of individuals, society, and planetary civilization, and saying we can actually choose what it's going to look like. Yes, there are very kind of strong narratives and path dependencies from the past, but at the end of the day, it's actually up to us. Now, why do you need that in an intertitle? Because you realize that you actually have more control and power than you think. You are not powerless. The quote unquote future as a noun isn't going to wash over you. When we do future, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. I think that it's really what brings hope. When I think back when I was younger, the age of between 20 and 30, which are the ages of my daughters, I was thinking I had all the possibilities in front of me. I mean, there was no negative feeling about the future. And when I compare them now, it's really about this official future, whatever it is, which looks dark and negative. And just to give you an example, they don't want kids. One of the reasons is don't put kids in this world. Who knows what will be in 10, 15, 20 years from now. And so what I really think is the future's thinking, it's really about bringing back this hope. This, it's just like breathing oxygen again.
It is. I mean, this is, look, it is not predetermined. And look, I understand where your daughters are coming from. If you look at the news.
They don't watch a lot of news. I think they stopped watching the news a long time ago because it was so negative.
But at the same time, we have to recognize the business imperative of news is to get you to watch and to read. And humans have what we call a negativity bias. We are constantly looking for things that are negative. Why? Negative things kill you, right? So again, not to take anything away from my children or from us, but if you think about us as like humans who are like all seeing, all knowing, some of this doesn't make sense. But then if you step back and say, oh, we're actually just very highly evolved primates making our way through this kind of planet, trying to figure stuff out, then you can kind of step back and say, okay, we have this negativity bias. It's always seeking out things that are negative because our prime directive is to live and to pass our genes on. And I don't mean to be overly biological about it, but that's in some ways kind of at the root. And by the way, a very spiritual person. I believe in a lot of different things. I also believe in kind of like you can't stop recognizing this hardware platform that we're built on, this biological DNA, where this is. And look, we're still figuring out, we're still discovering stuff. So obviously things that I say now, 20 years from now, they could be like, oh, there's no such thing as that. But negativity bias is something we very much understand. So we end up watching the news and we're always looking for these bad things because these bad things help us survive. The problem is they can get to a point where they eradicate a sense of hope and a sense of what can be. And you make a brilliant observation, which is in our 20s, we see all these different futures in front of us. But as we get older and we get married and we get a mortgage and it starts to kind of narrow down a little bit. That's okay because in that narrowing down, we can kind of get a little bit more comfortable. The problem is when we get too comfortable and we say, well, I'm just going to stay in this job for 40 years or stay in this relationship, and we don't kind of explore different ways of being. We stop being adaptable. What you are saying, where we went from our 20s, let's say, to our 40s or 50s, that's where we are as a planetary civilization right now. We kind of only see, oh, I'm just going to work at this job for 15 more years and then retire and then no one will visit me and it's over and then I die, right? That's one way of going about it. There's no hope in that, right? In that quote unquote future. Future thinking brings the hope back, right? So that's the first thing you need to have in this intertitle is a future's way of seeing the world, that all the doors are not closed, right? Because that gives you a sense of agency and a sense of hope that all is not lost. In fact, there's so much in front of us. So that's the first pillar. The second part of Longpath, the kind of the mindset, and the second and the third are kind of very connected. So I'll say both of them will go back to the first part, is transgenerational empathy, right? This is a connection to the past, present, and future through an empathetic lens, not an intellectual lens. We just did that in futures thinking in many ways, right? It's actually through emotion. We'll get back to the second why it's emotion and not just purely an intellectual exercise. The third component is what I call telos or ultimate aim or ultimate goal kind of way of thinking. And the reason why that's so important to help you navigate an intertitle is because it gives you something bigger than yourself to work on, a larger purpose. If you go to the self-help book section in any bookstore or online, every book that can help Ari or help Catherine, every book until maybe Longpath, is focused on how you can live your best life between your birth and your death. It's all about you. That's one of the things that we get, by the way, in this enlightenment. We get Bacon, and we get all these people saying, I think, therefore I am. It's all about the individual. Why? Because it's true. That's where you locate agency. And by placing it in the individual and not the church, you take the power back. You rebalance it. The problem is that leads us to a moment of hyper-individualism and a kind of narcissistic way of thinking about your purpose in the world. Now, what I'm about to say, some people will react against very strongly, as they have, but it's not about you. It's not just about you. It's not just about how you live a good life and find just your purpose. Because what that does is, where that comes from is we have a lifespan bias, right? It's kind of like, well, I'm the unit that matters, because that's what I've been told. You said this earlier. All the advertising for anything that wants you to buy something is about how you will feel better, how you will have fun, how you will be sexier, how you will be more loved, how at the root of what they're really saying is how you will survive and not be kicked out of the cave at night, right? That's kind of, when you go back 50,000 years with what old Catherine and old Ari were thinking about was, how do I make it through the night? It's really scary out there. And so all advertising is, you will be loved, but really it's really saying you will be safe. Okay, understandable. It sells a lot of cars, sells a lot of fancy vacations. But the issue is, when we kind of succumb to that lifespan bias, we start making decisions that are only for us in the present, which in itself, it can be okay, but it's not okay when it comes at the expense of future generations and their ability to flourish. Now, I'm going to say, and that exists on two levels. On one, a material level, that's climate change. That's what your daughters are. That's what a lot of people are reacting to, right? We are polluting this ecosphere that we live on, planet Earth, and it's not fair to have kids, right? And so we have to make decisions that allow them to flourish physically, 100%. That's kind of at the prime level, because without that, nothing else happens. The other layer, and this is where the transgenerational empathy component comes into play, is we want those future generations to be able to flourish in a way where they are psychologically, emotionally, and even spiritually developed in such a way that they are actually further along than us. So this is a kind of late breaking news. We are not as evolved as we think we are, right? I can talk to you on the computer. I can have a good conversation with my wife. We can work through some of our difficulties. The fact of the matter is, we're just at the very beginning of understanding from a sociological, but I'll really say psychological level of who we are and what we're capable of. And so transgenerational empathy is asking us to recognize that those who came before us, while they gave us, as we talked about earlier, certain baggages or certain emotional heirlooms, some was good, some was bad. What we have to recognize is they were doing the best they could with what they had. So it's less about them and more about the bad stuff they passed on. And it's also about they did what they could. And in the 1800s, 1900s, we didn't know as much about kind of how the brain works, how emotions work. We know a lot more now. And so it's incumbent upon us to, quote unquote, do the work. And there's 100 different modalities around what that means. Conscious parenting, it could be therapy, it could be a whole host of things. But what's so important for us to make it through this intertitle successfully, to navigate it skillfully, is to ensure that what we are passing on, yes, materially, is a regenerative planet, a cleaner air, cleaner water, all those material things, and regenerative, cleaner, if you will, I'm putting that in quotes, cleaner psychologies and emotions, and not passing on to our children. And if we don't have children, to other humans, especially younger humans, negative ways of doing and thinking things that came from our past. In other words, it's up to us not just to break the chain of those things, but to also build something better for generations to come.
It's basically taking responsibility.
Responsibility, and you're hitting all the great ones. It's responsibility for yourself, which a lot of people don't want to do, right? And I'm not victim blaming here, but a lot, because we're all kind of quote unquote guilty of this. Like, it's responsibility for what emotional state you inhabit at this very moment and how you got to this point, which in and of itself is very difficult. Trust me, I'm wrestling with this daily, as everyone is. But it's even a greater responsibility because now it's not just about you. It's about generations to come, right? So the way, and sorry if I'm personalized, the way I interact with my wife or with my children or with my colleagues isn't just yes, I need to be very responsible for that, but that actually reverberates throughout time. With our kids, it's the closest because they spend a whole bunch of time with us. With the person that I bump into accidentally at Starbucks, I may only have like a 5-second interaction with that human being in my entire life. I may never see them again. But how I behave in that moment, that behavior that I model, happens both. Some people will say happens at a spiritual level, right? That we can have that conversation. But if anything, it's kind of the triggering and the emotions and so if they bump into me at Starbucks and I yell and I snap at them and that gets their cortisol and their adrenaline up, that will reverberate throughout the day and everyone that they interact with and everyone they interact with, right? It's complexity, it's chaos theory. Yeah. Or if I do it in a different way, even in that very small interaction, and I apologize, I'm sorry, I was rushed, this is my fault, can I get you another coffee? That may seem super small and insignificant, but at scale, that actually is future changing. That is future shaping, right? And so when I say this, people say, oh, that's too new agey. That's just math. That's just how this works.
I think that just a smile goes beyond just the next person. It's really irradiating positivity into the data, into the days of others. So I think this is the easiest and first step everyone could do.
Yes, and the reason I kind of I have a slight recoil to that. At least I get as someone who's grown up with a lot of women in his life and with daughters. Sometimes women will be walking by like a construction site and the guys will yell down at them, "Hey, just give me a smile," right? So first and foremost, when you give, when someone, a man or a woman, should smile is obviously up to them. Now that we have that caveat out of the way, 100%. It can start something right there.
Yeah, I remember I was in my early 20s and I was in the car and there was a girl who wanted to cross the street and I just stopped. And she smiled back to me and I smiled to her, she smiled back to me. And it made my day. Yep. Just that simple. And I'm pretty sure it made her day as well. Yep. So it's just this kindness for the next.
Again, bringing up my wife, which she hates when I do it, but like she always when someone's trying to merge in traffic, she always lets people in. And, even if they come in at the last minute into the merge, right? And it's like so annoying because we've been all in line for 10 minutes and now this person's coming at the last second. She goes, listen, maybe they were taking a wrong direction and they have to get to the hospital before visiting hours are over and they want to visit their mom and they have to cut in, right? And so it's also assuming that kind of those best intentions. What does that do? It lets that person in. So it's an act of kindness, but it also keeps her, and as I'm trying to practice this, from rising up to a certain level. And again, someone listening would say, well, what does this have to do with climate change? What does this have to do with the dark, the deep 10,000 year futures of the Homo sapiens? It has everything to do with it. Because that then starts these you have no idea if your smile will, that viral emotions are very viral, by the way. You ever go to a dinner party and everyone's having a great time and then someone comes in who's in a really bad mood? Within 10 minutes, the whole room is bad. Emotions are highly, highly contagious. And so even showing that a sense of empathy, smiling, right? Or how the gaze that you give someone, right? A positive, that you have no idea where that ends, right? It may not even end that night. It may keep going because of the way, and again, I say this to people, say, wow, you're a futurist. You work with these huge corporations. How can a smile or a hello be future shaping? It doesn't have to be a big thing on artificial intelligence. Yes, we have to work on but here's the thing. All the people who are working on those big issues, people who are going to Egypt for COP27, people who are programming artificial intelligence or quantum computers are doing, they're just humans too,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the biases they take into the work they do, because no one's perfect, actually matter. So again, I'm not saying, if you smile at that person in the crosswalk, 2 years from now, that smile will reach the engineer working on the quantum computer and they may do something. I'm not necessarily saying that. I'm also not saying that, right? Because when you think about those small actions at scale, by scale, I mean billions of people, it starts to change who we are as a species. And this goes to something you said much earlier. We're so disconnected and kind of binary in our thinking that level of nuance is very much what we need at this moment. At this intertidal, that's what helps make it through. Because if we think about at least what's happening in, I should say, America, really around the world right now, with the rise of neo-populist movements about people reacting against elites and certain ways of thinking. I won't go into every country's politics, but a lot of what that is coming from people's fear and angst about tomorrow, because they're seeing the same thing that our kids are seeing. They're seeing the same headlines and saying, well, what am I going to do for a job and materially? And what we need to do is bring a sense of hope for tomorrow back. That isn't about just what could go wrong, but what could go right. And it starts by these very small actions that have great effects. And then, cascades from there. To be 100% clear, we still have to vote. We should still consume the right way, right? We should eat healthy food. We should buy organic when we can. And if it's regenerative, those things matter. Where we spend our dollars and our votes matter. But that can't be the only way we think about building tomorrows and building better futures. Because if it is, we're going to feel very disconnected when the only way we can impact tomorrow is at the checkout counter or in the voting booth. Longpath is a way of getting it much deeper.
It's being more aware.
Yeah. More conscious. This is about conscious decision-making, right? Conscious decision-making. Look, no one's, God, 4 times in the past 24 hours, I was not conscious in my decision-making, be it from what I ate, just because I was hungry, so I didn't eat the best stuff, right, to how I interact with other humans. But Longpath, it's a mindset. And you'll see in the book, there's multiple exercises that are meant to kind of inculcate that way of being. And look, I'm the author. I'm the one who came up with this. I'm the one who's been doing it for the longest time because I've been practicing it for a long time. I'm not 100% there yet, right? But again, just kind of what Longpath does, and I've been hearing this from people who've been reading it, especially people who are parents or even CEOs, is it kind of allows you to step back in a positive way to see a broader spectrum of where we exist in this grand project called kind of Homo sapiens, called reality. And it takes us out of the kind of micro, like, woe is me, what that deep short-termistic way of being, which our society is pushing on us, and it expands the aperture for what is possible. Doesn't mean we're all going to go run for president. Doesn't mean we're all going to go do these amazing, great human things, but it gives us a sense that all is not lost, that we can make it through, that we have made it through, right? The move from hunter-gatherer to agricultural, we don't have a lot of obviously written record or interviews of people moving from nomadic to agricultural, but we know it was difficult, but decisions were made that allowed it to lead towards the growth of our species. So the question is now, and you get right at this, is what are the decisions we make that allow for the conscious growth of our species? And what Longpath is saying is that growth is both external, positive, regenerative growth, and also conscious inner growth, right? And that's something that we've left on the side. We've been very focused on external material growth. It's great. There's billions of people not living in abject poverty like they were during the Middle Ages. Now is a time where we have to do 2 things at once, walk and chew gum. We have to think about conscious external growth or the material world. At the same time, we have to kind of elevate our game when it comes to internal consciousness around consciousness itself. It's tough, but I think as a species, we're at a point in our understanding of who and what we are and what makes us up that we can actually do that work.
I think it's really about bringing back together the yin and the yang, the East and the West, the intellectual and spiritual being whole again. I think we were kind of disconnected over the past centuries.
Well, I mean, and that was it. We threw the baby out with the bathwater, right? We had this kind of spiritual sense that was with the church, but we know that it wasn't all spiritual, right? It's about power and control and all sorts of crazy stuff. And then the way we kind of pushed it down was by eradicating the spiritual. Well, we threw out the spiritual with the religious, and the two are not the same. And we gave rise to the kind of material, technological, scientific. What will make it through? And I talk about this in the book. What will help us really through the intertidal, which is why the 3 pillars of Longpath aren't just pure technological or rational, but that's why emotion is so important. You can think about the emotional, that nuance is really also in some ways a kind of analog to what we call kind of Eastern sensibilities, right? A yin and yang, a non-dualistic way of thinking, right? Not to put too much on emotions, but that's in some ways what I'm saying in the book is, I could have said transgenerational Eastern ways of being, but that would make sense. But by saying emotion, I'm bringing in a lot of what that Eastern way of thinking is, right? And so you are spot on. When we look back, I don't know if we'll be here, but 100 years, 150 years from now, how we made it through. Yes, I think Longpath hopefully will have played a role, but whether or not you call it Longpath, it'll be a recognition that it was kind of reconnecting this false duality between us and nature, between science, rationality, and the spiritual realms. Bringing all of these together in a more symbiotic relationship is going to be how we are able to not only navigate this intertidal, but create the next thing. Again, I don't know what that next new world paradigm will be, but I think you are very, very correct that it will be an amalgam of these, what we classically call Eastern and Western ways of thinking, with also, and by the way, when I say Eastern, I don't just include Asia, I also include very much elements of like what we call Afrofuturism or African ways of thinking. So it's I don't want to make it just like East and West on the global Northern Hemisphere. It's just those non-dualistic ways of thinking. I'm leaving for Central America in a few days, and I've been reading about the Mayan calendar and how Mayan civilization, like I think all of that is very non-Western, and all of that will kind of come back into play in the years to come, and needs to if we're going to successfully kind of make it through this intertidal.
Yes, I think that somehow, yes, looking to the future, new technologies, this is great. And too often people have thought about, the past, it's old, maybe crap. We don't need it anymore. And there is so much wisdom in the ancient philosophies from wherever they come that we just forgot about them. I mean, this is something I really, since I was a kid, really wanted to know more about. My mom was a yoga teacher. I'm also a yoga teacher, so I got into this as well. This is what's missing nowadays, I think. And over the last years, people found out, and also with the lockdown, the pandemic, that there is more than just the material world, and they don't want to have the life anymore they had before.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things a friend of mine doesn't talk about ancient wisdom traditions. He talks about ancient wisdom technologies. It's a little bit of it's just interesting because if you think about it, technology is a thing that helps us become, Nietzsche said technology is the extension of man to become more godlike, right? That's what technology is. So if we think about ancient wisdom traditions or ancient wisdom technologies, things that allowed us to be bigger than just our hardwiring had us set for, right? Could be, remember, Homo sapiens are domesticated primates, right? A non-domesticated primate will still center aggression, right? Chimpanzees are a perfect example. Now you have the bonobos who in some ways have self-domesticated, right? Who have kind of taken aggression out of their way of interacting as a species. And as we all know, bonobos have sex like 15 times a day. Like they've kind of figured it out, right? In some ways. Now they don't have iPhones, but maybe they're better for it. I don't know. But so if we're a domesticated species, that's one thing. We've kind of pushed aggression out of how we make decisions. We've become much more pro-social. The question is, it's one thing just to quote unquote domesticate, but what are the next technologies, if you will? How do we take these ancient wisdom, these ways of thinking that they thought about for hundreds, if not thousands of years, about how humans can interoperate with one another in a successful, flourishing way? How do we take the best of that and then kind of apply that in the way that we also can create better, more regenerative material worlds that meet the needs of billions of people on this planet? That's the question and the struggle and the opportunity for my kids and your kids. Like, why do they go to school and why do they have kids? Is so that we can build those futures that look like that. The issue is is it's very hard to build it when you don't see it. So a large part of the work that I'm doing now is helping folks not just kind of live Longpath, but also start to think about what are those visions of better tomorrows that we want to see manifest, because we need to be able to see it and therefore feel it. We had some, if you look at Black Panther, if you look at Wakanda, this make-believe country of Wakanda, and you go into the capital, it's this amazing kind of, there's skyscrapers, but with windmills, with plants growing on them. I think they did an excellent job of showing this amalgam of old and new. And it's going to be, when I think about the artists and the cultural creators, I think it's going to become very incumbent upon them in the moment, in the years to come, to start showing us visions of what those worlds could look like. It doesn't have to just be cities. It could be families. It could be food. It could be whole systems. But that, I think, is what the avant-garde, if we think about it in the French term, right? The avant-garde in culture is going to be about showing us ways of being that are different than today, but are more hopeful, and show that reconnection between Eastern, Western ways of being, both externally, like Wakanda, and internally, like some of our great sages of the past 100 years.
It's kind of redoing Futurama as it was done in the past, but with better outcome.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. So I'm working on a project called Futurama right now around that, right? So, we think, so I don't know if we're talking about the same one. So Futurama was at the World Trade, the World's Fair in the 1960s. General Motors paid for it, right? This automobile company. So they showed all these positive visions of tomorrow. And we're going back to the official future conversation we had earlier. One of the things that Futurama did was, as you kind of got strapped into the seat and you were flown around this huge Futurama exhibit of tomorrow's cities and tomorrow's houses, the one thing that was obviously apparent, but really operating at a subconscious level, was that everywhere you went, there was an 8-lane highway or there were cars involved. Of course, because General Motors paid for it, right? So in all these positive visions of tomorrow, there was always a car at the center of it. It makes sense, right? Like they were building a narrative they were building the official future narrative of tomorrow that had cars, which is how they made their money, at the center of it. Now we have to start thinking about Futuramas that don't center cars necessarily, right? But that center human and planetary flourishing. Now the question is, who's in the best interest of doing that, right? I think, and by the way, I'm not knocking business. I think there are plenty of businesses out there that are building those ideas of what tomorrow looks like in terms of energy, in terms of food and whatnot. And it's going to be about them, but also about the public, because it's going to be co-created, about what are those Futuramas, if you will, in plural, that we need to build to start seeing, to have people start walking through. Because one, if you can't see it, you can't be it, right? So you need to be able to see what you're aiming for, recognizing there's a multiplicity of those things. And B, you need to give a sense of hope in a hopeless age, right? Because the official future right now is collapsing. So our children just see, we're like in our 1970s, we're like in the 70s. We see very limited possibilities or way out of this. That's just false advertising, right? In terms of the tomorrows, because we don't have anything else out there. So if anyone's listening to this who's thinking about culture and thinking about creativity, and it can be books, films, TVs, artwork, curriculums, we need to start painting, quote unquote, those pictures and those visions. It can be very niche. I would love to see a painting of a dinner table 50 years from now and where the food comes from and more about it, right? To something much bigger like cities or spiritual centers or schools or even criminal justice. That's where we're at. That's what we have to start doing right now as a society, is painting those visions to bring the hope back, because that then brings back a sense of agency, which then allows people to kind of pick themselves off their couch and start doing the work to creating those tomorrows that we want.
Yes. You were talking about the Voros cone. So it's really about not just one future. You have as many futures as you want.
Yeah. We could take this ship called humanity in multiple directions right now, and it feels like we're just the Titanic heading for the iceberg. And here's the thing: I'm going to be totally honest. Like, we're going to touch the iceberg, right? We're already touching it. Look at the floods in Pakistan. Look at the wildfires. We're scraping that iceberg. Now, do we decide to go ahead? Are we going to go strongly into it, Because if so, we're going to pull a Titanic. Or do we want to start veering off of it? To do that will require some significant changes in how we structure our economy, our psychologies, our world. But we're not going to hit it tomorrow. It's not like that at all. And we're starting to see that, right? We're in a better place just in terms of climate change now than where we thought we would be 10 years ago, just in terms of emissions. Now, that being said, we're seeing floods and wildfires and droughts a little bit earlier than we thought we were going to see them. And we're seeing global temperature change faster than we thought we were going to see it. But we're doing the work. Now we have to both do the work. We have to continue to do the work externally. And we have to do the internal work. Because I do believe Homo sapiens humanity will go on. There's not going to be a Look, we can always get hit by a meteor. Okay, right? Those things could happen. The reality is we're going to go on. But what kind of humans do we want to put into the future? We can make those decisions right now. We can think about the material realm, and we can think about the internal realm as well. I'm asking folks to do the work you have to do on the material realm, the activism, the consuming the right way, the voting the right way, and at the same time to do the internal work, because that internal work is going to be the heirlooms and the baggage that we are going to pass on. Do we want to pass on positive emotional ways of being in the world to future generations, or do we want to do negative ones? So if we want to kind of break that cycle and be conscious about it, that will, I think, can be the greatest legacy that we give to future generations. A clean planet, a biosphere that's flourishing, 100%, economies that work for all, allowing people to find purpose and meaning in their life, all of those things. And if that wasn't enough, and psychologically, internally, better ways of being that are healthier in relationship to others and to ourselves. So that inner voice of judgment when you walk by a mirror that says, I'm too fat, I'm too this, I'm not enough that. Here, I got news for folks. We don't have to have that. You don't have to have that. I believe we can have less of it right now, but they may look back decades, if not centuries from now, and be like, wow, people had all these issues that they didn't realize were coming from the external world because of all sorts of things. They just weren't aware of it. I'm asking us right now to become aware of it, so that we can pivot the internal realms of judgment and despair towards something that we can gift to future generations that's in a much better place than we're at right now. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not easy, but we got to do it.
It really starts with compassion and empathy towards ourselves first.
Yeah. Look, in the book, when I talk about transgenerational empathy, people who hear that term then will, not to give anything away, they'll go into the book and they'll be like, I was expecting you to have empathy for the future, and I was expecting you to have empathy for the past. That makes sense. I didn't realize a chunk of the book was about empathy for myself and self-compassion for myself. That's where it starts. Because I can't go back and change the past. I can alter the future somehow by how I am now, but I can't do that until I have it for myself. Now, this isn't a 1,000-page book where I say, these are the 27 things you have to do to have that. There are exercises to kind of kickstart one on that. But the long path for Homo sapiens is going to start with people doing that internal work. Because I can't tell you how many people I meet who are futurists or doing amazing work in the world, but are on the inside, they have so much despair and sadness. And I understand, look, we all have that. But and also they have a lot of anger, and they're not nice to their partners or to their kids. And so, to me, it doesn't matter if you invent something amazing if your kids don't like you because you're a terrible parent. Because the fact of the matter is, in the end, you're now just passing along some really bad emotions that are going to play out over the next several centuries. So I'd rather you less time. Look, I want you to invent the food of tomorrow 100%, or I want you to do great political work. But if you're not being a great human and a great ancestor to those right around you right now, you have to step back and think about, is that going to be my legacy? Just this external part of my obituary, right? Because the third paragraph of your obituary is the one people focus on. And I ask people to focus on that. What did you do in the external world, right? Because the first little paragraph is your name and how and when you died. The second one is who you left behind. The third one becomes the external stuff that you see on your resume. And I ask people to think about the external one because it helps guide them in what they should be doing in their external life. But as importantly, and it's kind of hidden in that second paragraph, is who you leave behind and who you touched. You may have kids, you may not have kids, but that's usually, quote unquote, in the second paragraph. how you are in your day-to-day interactions with them matters as much as that third paragraph, right? And in a society that is so focused on external validations of success, we lose sight of how important those relationships are. One, because in a narcissistic way, it helps you live a better, more healthy, happy life. In a non-narcissistic way, thinking about the futures as a futurist, it actually lays foundations for the thousands, if not millions of generations of humans that will follow from you and after you pass away. It's a lot of responsibility. It's a lot, but that's where we are right now. We have an understanding of this, and you can't stick your head in the sand.
No, I really think, I really enjoy journaling every day. And I think it's brilliant having put all these exercises and questions into the book. And I think it's the best start. And also think how you want to show up. How do you want to feel? Not just for yourselves, but for others.
Yep. So that's core. That's core. And I know, people are like, oh, what's the futures writing about all this stuff? Because I care about the futures. I care about it. I'm not going to predict it, but I know the best way we can help create those tomorrows that are better than the ones of today, what we call protopias, right? I don't believe in dystopia thinking. It collapses on itself. I don't believe in utopian thinking. It collapses itself, right? Because then you have all the answers. You're not adaptive. You're not, you're not agile. So I believe in protopia, which is this idea of better tomorrows than we have today, both external and internal. And if we want to work on manifesting those protopias, it starts with the inner work kind of interlinked with the external work. It's a lot. It's very heavy. I get that. But that's kind of where we are. This is the big intertitle, right? This is the one that I believe the reverberations and ramifications will be with our species for hundreds, but definitely for hundreds and maybe for thousands of years. So, I'll give the date. I don't know when you're doing this podcast. So November of 2522, right? 500 years from now, I think they'll look back on this age as the one that set them up to be who they are in many ways. Really, this generation, right? Because we have so much at stake. And so I hope for people who are listening or who are reading, recognize there's a lot at play. There's a lot of work to be done. And hopefully Longpath is a contribution, one of many contributions to how we may skillfully navigate this moment and build those better tomorrows.
I think it's really, like I said before, it's bringing oxygen and the possibility to breathe freely again. This is how I felt reading the book. I think that people should really go through the exercises and journal, take the time and journal about this, because it makes everything so much clearer for yourself. And you can't unread what you read. So you can't go back. Yeah.
Well, thank you. So look, if people want to know more, they can sign up for the newsletter, more stuff at longpath.org. The book is being sold everywhere. I think you can get it as a Kindle, and I hope, people get the most they can out of it. But to your point, when I hear back from people who read the book, they say, like, after I read the book, I just see things very differently. And if that's what we want people to be able to see the world slightly different than the way they had been seeing it. And hopefully in that new scene, in those new lenses, they're able to be in a way, both in their moment to moment, but also in the grander scheme that leads towards better futures that maximize flourishing for as many people as possible on an ecologically thriving planet Earth. That's not too much to ask, but that's the goal.
It's really not too much to ask. Just a last quick question. I saw that you have the Longpath gatherings.
Yep. So we started doing these Longpath gatherings right before COVID, and obviously we stopped, and now you can sign up for them on longpath.org. It's bringing people together. So we started doing it at WeWorks, co-working places along the East Coast of the United States. And we're going to bring them back. And really what this is groups of people gathered between 8 to 12 people. It's self-led. There's kind of a workbook called the Longpath Journey. So you read the book, you do this workbook together as a group, and then you kind of move from there. And it kind of, again, it's kind of like working out. You need accountability partners to kind of help you kind of stay on the path, if you will. And that sounds a little bit over the top, but it's really kind of a group to help you check in on making decisions, both major and minor. And I think in a moment of such high isolation, coming both out of COVID and just the way our society is currently manifesting, any contribution or any way that people can come together, both either digitally or ideally in person, is going to help us, because you'll see this at the kind of toward the last two chapters of the book. I say, look, we have to create these futures that we want, but really the way we do it is we do it by co-creating the futures that we want, and we do that in relation, right? So Longpath isn't kind of just an internal journey. It's not this thing where you just kind of do only by yourself. It's how you show up for yourself and how you show up for others. And so once you start doing that, you can start having these conversations about what are the futures that we want. And the best way to do that is to do that in community. So Longpath Gather is a way of bringing people together in that community. So hopefully people, if they're interested in taking the next step after the book, will sign up for that.
Okay, I will put all the links anyway below the video. And I think we could speak for hours about this subject.
But I don't want to burn people out. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you for joining today. I really enjoyed our conversation, and looking forward to see this change in humanity.
Thank you. And thank you again for having me. And if you listen the whole time, thank you so much for being with us, and look forward, you can find me on Instagram at RAW, or maybe Twitter for another day or two. Just let me know what you thought. I'll answer any questions. Thank you again.
Thank you, Ari.